The Uinta Basin is a broad valley in northeastern Utah, approximately 100 miles long and 60 miles wide, ringed by the Uinta Mountains to the north and the Book Cliffs to the south. The Duchesne River drains most of the basin floor before joining the Green River to the east. It is oil and gas country. The basin contains one of the largest oil shale deposits in North America, and energy development has shaped its modern economy. The towns, Roosevelt, Vernal, Duchesne, are working towns, not tourist destinations. The geology is genuinely unusual. The Uinta Basin is a structural depression formed by tectonic subsidence over tens of millions of years, and the rock record it contains spans an unusually complete range of geological periods. The underlying formations include significant deposits of quartz and feldspar, both of which are piezoelectric. They generate measurable electrical voltage when subjected to mechanical stress, including the kind of stress produced continuously by the tectonic forces that created the basin. Piezoelectricity is not exotic science. It is well understood physics with industrial applications in everything, from microphones to automotive sensors. The specific relevance to the Uinta Basin is that tectonic stress on piezoelectric rock generates electrical fields. Those fields are measurable. Surveys of the basin's electromagnetic environment have documented anomalies, field strengths, and frequency signatures that exceed what the identified geological sources would be expected to produce. Whether these electromagnetic anomalies are relevant to the unusual phenomena reported in the basin is genuinely uncertain. The correlation between unusual geology and unusual reported phenomena exists. The causal mechanism, if any, has not been established. These are the honest parameters of the geological context. The Ute people's relationship to the Uinta Basin predates written records by centuries. Their traditional territory encompassed not just the valley floor, but the surrounding mountain ranges, and the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in the basin represents a fraction of their original range. The Ute tradition identifies the basin and specific areas within it as requiring particular behavioral protocols. This is documented in accounts from Ute community members who have spoken to researchers including George Knapp, though the full depth of the relevant traditional knowledge has not been made fully public. Some of it is considered private to the community. What is public is the general character. The basin contains places where unusual things happen and where specific care is warranted. The Sherman family was told this before they moved onto the ranch property in 1994. Knapp has documented these conversations in his reporting. What should be said carefully here is what the traditional knowledge is and is not as evidence. It is accumulated empirical observation from people with the longest direct experience of a specific landscape, centuries of direct contact producing practical knowledge about what that landscape produces. It is not proof of any specific explanation for what that landscape produces. It is evidence that the basin has been recognized as unusual by the people with the most experience of it. That is a meaningful distinction. The traditional knowledge is real and worth taking seriously. It should not be inflated into confirmation of specific theories about interdimensional portals or non-human intelligence for which it is not evidence in any established sense. The history of reported unusual phenomena in the Uinta Basin extends back further than the Sherman family and the NIDS investigation. George Knapp documented settler accounts from the 19th century in his reporting on Skinwalker Ranch. These accounts describe, in the fragmentary way of historical records not compiled with research methodology in mind, experiences consistent with what the Sherman family encountered a century later. Unusual lights, cattle found dead in inexplicable circumstances, a persistent quality about specific areas that those who lived near them recognized and navigated around. The most relevant historical documentation involves the Ute community's own records. The accounts that have been shared publicly describe the basin's unusual characteristics as a feature of the landscape that has always been there, not something that started with European contact or with any particular event, but a persistent characteristic of the place itself. Fort Duchesne, established by the U.S. Army in 1886, generated its own historical record. Army personnel stationed there in the late 19th century filed reports through official channels describing unusual events in the basin. Reports that are scattered through the National Archives in records that have not been systematically compiled for research purposes. The existence of these records has been noted by researchers, but their full content has not been documented in the public literature. The NIDS investigation at the specific ranch property in the basin has been covered in the 2 preceding episodes. What is worth adding here, in the context of the broader basin, is how the ranch relates to the surrounding area. The ranch property sits in a specific section of the basin approximately 15 miles east of Vernal. Its location within the broader basin is not random in terms of the geological characteristics described above. The electromagnetic anomalies documented at the site are consistent with, though more concentrated than, the broader pattern of anomalies in the basin. Neighboring ranchers and residents in the area around the ranch have, over the years since the Skinwalker Ranch story became public, described their own experiences in the surrounding area. These accounts have been collected informally by researchers and by journalists, including Knapp. They describe experiences similar in character to what the Shermans reported: unusual lights, cattle behavioral changes, animals avoiding specific areas, and in some cases, direct encounters that the witnesses describe as inexplicable. These neighboring accounts are worth noting because they suggest the phenomena documented at the ranch are not contained to the specific property, but are distributed across the surrounding area at lower intensity. The ranch may represent the most concentrated expression of something that characterizes a broader section of the basin. This is consistent with what the Ute traditional knowledge describes. The ranch sits in an area that the tradition identifies as particularly significant within a broader region that the tradition identifies as unusual. The convergence of these independent indicators, geological, historical, traditional, and the neighboring accounts, points at a geography rather than at a single property. That geography is the Uinta Basin, with the specific ranch area as its most intensively documented point. Paul Devereux's Earthlights research provides the most physically grounded partial explanation for one category of what the basin produces. Devereux, a British researcher, documented in his 1982 book Earthlights the correlation between geologically active terrain and reports of luminous aerial phenomena. His subsequent work including Earthlight's revelation in 1990, refined the hypothesis and examined the specific geological mechanisms involved. His argument, piezoelectric rock under tectonic stress, can produce localized plasma formations through mechanisms involving the conversion of mechanical stress to electrical energy and its subsequent discharge into the atmosphere. These formations, Earthlights, are physically real, transient, and can exhibit behavior that witnesses unfamiliar with the phenomenon find inexplicable. The physical mechanism Devereux proposes has some experimental support. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist at Laurentian University in Canada, conducted laboratory experiments demonstrating that tectonic stress on rock samples produces electrical discharges. His broader research examined the relationship between seismic activity and unusual aerial phenomena reports, finding correlations that he published in peer-reviewed journals. Persinger's work is contested. His more speculative claims about electromagnetic fields affecting human perception and producing anomalous experiences have not been replicated reliably. His core findings about the correlation between seismic activity and luminous phenomena reports are more robust. For the Uinta Basin specifically, the basin sits in a seismically active region. The Wasatch Fault, one of the most seismically significant faults in the American West, runs along the basin's western edge. Tectonic stress in the area is ongoing and measurable. The specific geological composition of the basin includes the piezoelectric minerals that Devereux's hypothesis identifies as relevant. Whether Earthlights account for a significant portion of what has been reported in the basin is uncertain. The hypothesis is physically grounded and consistent with some of the documented phenomena. It does not account for the cattle mutilation cases, the creature encounters, or the poltergeist activity documented at the ranch. It is a partial physical explanation for one category of observation. That is its honest status, partial, physically grounded, and worth considering alongside other possible explanations rather than as a complete account. The Department of Energy geological surveys of the Uinta Basin in the 1970s are relevant to understanding what the government has known about the basin's unusual characteristics. The surveys were conducted as part of broader resource assessment programs during the energy crisis period. The basin's oil shale deposits made it a subject of significant government interest for energy development purposes. Comprehensive geological surveys were standard practice. Some findings from those surveys were classified. The publicly available portions document the basin's geological characteristics, including the electromagnetic anomalies noted above. What was in the classified portions is not known. Several researchers who have examined the Uinta Basin situation have noted the timing. The DOE surveys in the 1970s were conducted during a period when classified government programs related to anomalous aerial phenomena, the successors to Project Blue Book, were active. The possibility that the geological survey's classified portions contain findings relevant to those programs is speculative but not unreasonable given the timing and the location. This should be held as a possibility worth noting rather than a conclusion. Geological surveys of resource-significant areas are classified for many reasons, most of them mundane. The coincidence of timing and location is interesting. It does not establish that the classified portions of the surveys contain anything about anomalous phenomena. The broader comparative context helps clarify what the Uinta Basin represents in the global landscape of documented high-strangeness locations. The Hessdalen Valley in central Norway has been producing reports of unusual luminous phenomena since at least the 1930s. Project Hessdalen, the Norwegian scientific research program that has been instrumentally monitoring the valley since 1983, has documented the phenomena using radar, spectrographic analysis, and photography. The phenomena are real in the specific sense that instruments have detected them. Their nature is not established. The Project Hessdalen team has proposed several possible explanations without reaching consensus. The Hessdalen Valley sits in a region with geological characteristics similar to those described for the Uinta Basin. Complex geology, significant mineral deposits with electromagnetic properties, seismic activity. The San Luis Valley in southern Colorado, documented extensively by researcher Christopher O'Brien in his books Secrets of the Mysterious Valley and Enter the Valley, shows a similar pattern. Elevated UAP reports, cattle mutilation cases, and unusual phenomena distributed across a valley with specific geological characteristics. O'Brien's documentation spans decades and is more systematic than most comparable work. What these locations share: unusual geology, elevated reports across multiple categories of anomalous phenomena, traditional knowledge from indigenous communities identifying the areas as significant, and documented evidence that persists across time. What distinguishes the Uinta Basin from these comparatives is the depth of the NIDS investigation. No other comparable location has received the same level of sustained, instrumented, multi-year scientific investigation. That investigation produced the most extensive documentation of a single high-strangeness location in the public record. It also produced the most honest account of the limits of what such investigation can establish. Kelleher's carefully stated finding that the phenomena documented are genuine anomalies whose explanation remains open. That combination of extensive documentation and honest uncertainty is the Uinta Basin's primary contribution to the broader understanding of these phenomena. The practical significance of the Uinta Basin for anyone trying to understand what this series documents is this: the basin is not unique. It is the most documented example of a type of location that appears globally. Locations where specific geological and hydrological characteristics correlate with elevated frequencies of reported anomalous phenomena across multiple independent categories. Understanding what the Uinta Basin produces requires understanding the type, not just the instance. The same questions that apply there apply to Hessdalen, to the San Luis Valley, to the Yakima Valley in Washington state, and to several locations in the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachians, and the Great Lakes region that have lower documentation levels but similar geographic profiles. The explanation for what these locations produce, if a single explanation accounts for all of them, will apply across all of them. It will not be specific to northeastern Utah. The research that would establish that explanation has not been conducted systematically across comparable locations. Individual locations have been studied in isolation. The comparative analysis that would identify what they share and what that sharing means has not been done. That gap in the research record is the honest summary of where the understanding of these locations currently stands. Real evidence that something worth investigating is occurring in specific places with specific characteristics. No established explanation for what that something is or why those characteristics matter. The investigation is partial and ongoing. That is what the evidence shows. The specific timeline of events at and around the ranch property between 1994 and the present day helps clarify what is documented versus what is claimed. 1994. Sherman family purchases the property. Within weeks, Terry Sherman encounters a large animal near the tree line that does not react to rifle fire. Cattle mutilations begin. Family reports poltergeist-type activity in the farmhouse. Unusual lights observed over the property. 1995. Additional cattle deaths. The incident involving the creature in the tree and the 3 dogs that do not return. Continued aerial phenomena. Terry Sherman contacts local media. 1996. George Knapp visits the ranch and begins his investigation. Robert Bigelow, after reading press coverage, contacts the Shermans. Bigelow purchases the property from the Shermans. Shermans move off the property. 1996 to 2004. NIDS investigation. The team instruments the property and conducts sustained observation. Kelleher documents physical anomalies in cattle mutilation tissue, electromagnetic readings, soil chemistry changes, and the monitoring gap pattern described in the previous episode. 2004. Bigelow contracts with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the beginning of the relationship that would eventually become the AATIP program. 2016. Bigelow sells the property to Adamantium Holdings, connected to Utah businessman Brandon Fugel. 2020 onward. History Channel documentary series about the property begins airing. New investigation team installs additional monitoring equipment. Reports of continued unusual events. This timeline matters because it establishes what the documented record actually covers. The Sherman family's 2 years on the property. The NIDS multi-year investigation. The gap between NIDS and the current television-era investigation. The phenomena documented in each period are not equally well evidenced. The NIDS period has the strongest evidentiary basis. Trained investigators with consistent methodology over multiple years. The Sherman family period has consistent accounts from credible witnesses. The television-era documentation has the limitations inherent in commercial production. Distinguishing between these periods and the different evidentiary standards they represent is part of engaging honestly with the ranch's history. The cattle mutilation phenomenon that appears throughout the ranch's documented history is worth examining in the context of what is known about the broader pattern of cattle mutilation reports across the American West. The phenomenon has been reported across the United States since at least the 1960s, with significant concentrations in Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska, Montana, and the Uinta Basin area of Utah. The first major wave of media attention came in 1975, when Colorado ranchers reported dozens of animals found dead with the standard profile: excised organs, clean incisions, absent blood, no tracks. The FBI conducted a limited investigation in 1979 under Agent Donald Flickinger, prompted by requests from New Mexico Senator Harrison Schmitt. The investigation produced a report concluding that the mutilations were attributable to predator and scavenger activity. The report has been criticized for relying primarily on the conventional explanation without engaging seriously with the cases where that explanation was forensically examined and found inadequate. The forensic examination issue is the crux of the debate. Standard predator and scavenger feeding does produce wounds that untrained observers describe as surgical. The specific critique from researchers like Linda Moulton Howe, who has documented mutilation cases extensively since the 1970s, and from veterinary pathologists who have examined specific cases, is that the conventional explanation does not account for the cellular characteristics of the incision margins in the most anomalous cases. At the NIDS investigation, the relevant finding is specific. Tissue samples from mutilation cases at the ranch were analyzed by veterinary pathologists who documented cellular characteristics at wound margins inconsistent with the range produced by known cutting tools. This is a specific finding in specific cases. It does not apply to all mutilation reports. It applies to the cases the NIDS team examined with laboratory methodology. The honest position. The conventional explanation accounts for many reported mutilation cases. The cellular findings from the NIDS examinations are genuine anomalies that the conventional explanation does not account for. The mechanism that produced those specific cellular characteristics has not been identified. The electromagnetic monitoring data from the NIDS investigation is the category of physical evidence that has received the least public attention, but is arguably the most significant. Standard electromagnetic monitoring in wilderness areas, away from human infrastructure, produces baseline readings that are relatively stable. Natural variation in the electromagnetic environment, from weather systems, solar activity, and geological processes, occurs within predictable ranges. What the NIDS monitoring recorded at the ranch were readings outside those ranges. Specific frequency signatures appearing in temporal correlation with reported events. Field strengths exceeding what the identified geological sources should produce. The significance of this data lies in what it suggests about the physical nature of whatever produces the ranch's documented events. If the phenomena are associated with measurable electromagnetic anomalies, they are interacting with the physical world in a way that instruments can detect. That is meaningful. It means the phenomena are not purely perceptual or psychological. They have a physical signature. What that physical signature means, what mechanism produces it, what relationship it has to the events it correlates with, is not established. The electromagnetic data is consistent with Devereux's Earthlights hypothesis for some portion of the documented phenomena. It is consistent with other possible explanations. It is not conclusive evidence for any of them. The broader basin context makes one specific geographical point that deserves direct statement. The ranch property is approximately 12 miles from the Ute Reservation boundary. The traditional knowledge that Ute community members attempted to convey to the Sherman family was not abstract cultural history. It was practical knowledge about land that is adjacent to their own. People do not develop and maintain practical behavioral protocols about land they have no direct experience with. The Ute protocols around specific areas of the basin, maintained across generations, reflect long direct experience of what those areas produce. The content of those protocols, beyond the general character that has been shared publicly, is held by the community that developed them, and they have the right to maintain it as private. What has been shared publicly is enough to establish that the traditional knowledge is specific, practical, and has been consistent across generations. That is what it is. Real accumulated knowledge about a real place, not confirmation of any specific theory, evidence that the place has been recognized as unusual by the people with the longest direct experience of it. The question of what the Uinta Basin research record means for the subjects this series covers deserves a direct answer. It means that the unusual phenomena documented at Skinwalker Ranch are part of a broader geographic pattern. The ranch is not an isolated anomaly. It sits within a basin that has been producing unusual reports across multiple independent sources: geological surveys, traditional knowledge, historical settler accounts, neighboring resident accounts, for as long as any record reaches. That broader pattern strengthens the case for taking the ranch documentation seriously. A single unusual location could be many things. A pattern of unusual reports across a broad geographic area with consistent geological and hydrological characteristics is harder to dismiss. It also means that the investigation of the basin as a whole has not kept pace with the investigation of the single property. The ranch has been studied intensively. The basin has not. The comparison with Hessdalen, where systematic monitoring has operated across the broader valley rather than a single point, illustrates what a more complete investigation would look like. The Uinta Basin deserves that kind of investigation. The evidence for it is substantial. The institutional will to conduct it is absent. That gap between the evidence and the investigation is consistent with the pattern documented throughout this series, and it is the honest place for this episode to end. The neighboring ranchers and long-term residents of the basin who have described their own experiences represent an under-examined dimension of the documentary record. Most of these accounts have not been formally collected. They exist in conversations with journalists, in informal notes by researchers who have visited the area, and in the memories of people who have not sought public attention. Their fragmented state reflects the absence of systematic fieldwork in the broader basin rather than the absence of experiences worth documenting. What has been recorded shares consistent characteristics: cattle behavioral changes in specific areas, animals refusing to enter certain pastures, bunching at fence lines, showing sustained distress without visible cause, unusual lights at night in the sky over the basin, distinct from aircraft and weather phenomena in ways that experienced outdoor people note specifically. A small number of more direct encounters, large unidentified animals seen at distance, sounds not matching any known wildlife. These accounts, taken individually, are the kind of evidence that conventional analysis routes to misidentification or dismissal without serious examination. Taken together from independent sources across a consistent geographic area over an extended time period, they suggest something more systematic. The comparison with the San Luis Valley in Colorado is instructive here. Christopher O'Brien spent years systematically collecting accounts from valley residents before publishing his research. The body of evidence he assembled, fragmented individually, coherent collectively, made a case for the valley's unusual character that no single account could have supported. The Uinta Basin has not received equivalent systematic documentation outside the ranch property. The accounts exist. The collection and analysis has not been done. One specific aspect of the basin's history that does not appear in most coverage is the relationship between the basin and the nuclear weapons program. The Nevada test site, where the United States conducted above-ground nuclear tests from 1951 to 1963, lies approximately 200 miles southwest of the Uinta Basin. Fallout from those tests reached the basin. Studies of thyroid cancer rates in communities downwind of the Nevada test site identified elevated rates in several Utah communities, including some in the basin area. The relevance of this history is indirect. The population of communities near the Nevada test site and downwind of the tests was subject to significant radiation exposure for over a decade without public disclosure of the risks. The downwinder litigation of the 1980s and 1990s established that the government had deliberately withheld health information from affected communities. This history is relevant not as a direct explanation for basin phenomena, but as context for understanding the institutional relationships between the federal government and the communities in the Uinta Basin region. The pattern of withholding relevant information from affected communities while conducting activities that affected them has documented precedent in this specific geographic region. That precedent does not establish that the government is withholding information about Skinwalker Ranch or the basin's anomalous phenomena. It does establish that the institutional culture of the agencies that manage this region has, in documented historical cases, prioritized other considerations over disclosure to affected communities. The honest summary of what makes the Uinta Basin significant for the subjects this series covers is this: it is a geographically specific, instrumentally documented, traditionally acknowledged, and historically consistent location where multiple independent lines of evidence point at unusual phenomena across an extended time period. The geological characteristics are real and documented. The traditional knowledge is real and specific. The historical accounts are real though fragmentary. The NIDS investigation produced real physical anomalies. The neighboring resident accounts add breadth to the picture that the single property investigation cannot provide. None of these establishes what the phenomena are. Each contributes to the evidence that they are real and that they are worth serious investigation. The investigation that has been conducted is the most extensive for any comparable location in the public record. It is still incomplete relative to what the evidence warrants. That incompleteness, the gap between what the evidence suggests should be investigated and what has actually been investigated, is the honest characterization of where the research on the Uinta Basin stands. The basin will continue being what it is. The investigation it deserves has not yet been conducted. That is both a statement about the specific location and a statement about the broader institutional failure this series has been documenting from multiple angles. The evidence is there. The will to take it seriously at the institutional level largely is not. That gap has consequences for researchers trying to understand what the basin produces, for communities living within it, and for anyone trying to build an honest picture of what the evidence on anomalous phenomena actually shows. The Hessdalen Valley comparison deserves more specific treatment because it represents the best available model for what systematic investigation of a high-strangeness basin looks like. Hessdalen is a remote valley in the Røros municipality of central Norway, approximately 120 kilometers southeast of Trondheim. The valley is sparsely populated, a few dozen permanent residents, and sits at an elevation of about 800 meters, surrounded by hills. Unusual lights have been reported there since at least the 1930s. The modern documentation began seriously in 1981 and 1982, when the reports increased dramatically. Witnesses described lights appearing multiple times per week. Project Hessdalen, organized by Norwegian engineer Erling Strand and supported by the Norwegian UFO organization, began instrumental monitoring in 1983. What the project found in its initial intensive fieldwork period of 1984 was remarkable by the standards of anomalous phenomena research. The phenomena were real enough to be detected by multiple independent instruments simultaneously. Radar returns were recorded at the same time as visual observations. Spectrographic analysis of photographed lights showed specific spectral profiles. A laser aimed at one of the phenomena produced a measurable response. The light appeared to respond to the laser by flashing in a pattern. This instrumental confirmation is what distinguishes Hessdalen from most comparable locations. The phenomena there are not simply reported by witnesses. They have been detected by radar. They have been spectrographically characterized. They interact with instruments in ways that document their physical reality beyond witness testimony alone. The geological substrate of the Hessdalen Valley includes sulfide mineral deposits and a specific combination of rock types that Norwegian geologists have noted as unusual. The valley sits near a major geological boundary between different rock formations. Electromagnetic surveys of the area have documented anomalies. Project Hessdalen continues to the present. A permanent monitoring station was installed in 1998. The phenomena have continued at lower frequency than the early 1980s peak, but are still documented regularly. The comparison with the Uinta Basin is direct. Both are basins with unusual geology. Both have long histories of reported luminous phenomena. Both have traditional knowledge from the communities with the longest local presence, identifying them as significant locations. The difference is the investigation. Hessdalen has had systematic instrumental monitoring for 40 years. The Uinta Basin had the NIDS investigation of a single ranch property for approximately 8 years. What systematic monitoring of the broader basin over a comparable period might reveal has never been tested. The Michael Persinger research provides another angle on the geophysical hypothesis that is worth examining honestly rather than either endorsing or dismissing. Persinger was a neuroscientist at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, who spent decades examining the relationship between geomagnetic activity and human experience. His work falls into two categories that should be kept distinct. His core seismological research, documenting correlations between seismic activity and elevated rates of unusual phenomena reports, is published in peer-reviewed geology and geophysics journals and has been replicated by independent researchers. The basic finding that times of elevated seismic stress correlate with elevated unusual aerial phenomena. Reports in the same geographic areas is a real finding with a genuine evidence base. His neuroscience research, proposing that fluctuating magnetic fields can produce anomalous perceptual experiences, including feelings of presence, unusual sensory experiences, and in his laboratory setting, experiences some subjects described as encounters with non-human entities is more contested. His famous God helmet experiments, in which subjects wore a helmet generating weak magnetic fields and reported unusual experiences, were not replicated by a 2004 Swedish study under controlled conditions. The replication failure does not definitively refute his hypothesis, but substantially weakens the laboratory evidence for it. What Persinger's work suggests, taken honestly, geomagnetic activity correlates with unusual aerial phenomena reports across large geographic areas. Whether geomagnetic fluctuations directly produce human perceptual anomalies through the mechanisms he proposed is not established. For the Uinta Basin, if elevated geomagnetic activity in the basin correlates with elevated rates of unusual phenomena reports, that is a testable hypothesis. The monitoring to test it systematically has not been conducted there. The cattle mutilation geography matters for understanding the Uinta Basin's place in the broader pattern. NIDS researcher Colm Kelleher, before focusing on the ranch investigation, co-authored a study of cattle mutilation reports across the American West. The study, published in 1997 in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, documented 83 confirmed mutilation cases from multiple states and analyzed their geographic distribution. The findings: the cases were not randomly distributed across the cattle-raising areas of the West. They clustered in specific geographic regions. The clustering corresponded to areas with specific geological characteristics, elevated seismic activity, specific mineral compositions, and proximity to geological boundaries between different rock formations. The Uinta Basin area was among the highest density clusters in the study. This geographic analysis is one of the more carefully conducted pieces of research in the broader field of cattle mutilation documentation. It provides a specific, analyzed finding about the geographic pattern of the phenomenon, rather than simply accumulating reports. What it demonstrates: the cattle mutilation phenomenon is geographically patterned in ways that correspond to geological features. Whether the geological features cause the mutilations or both the mutilations and the geology reflect a common factor, or the correlation has some other explanation, the study does not establish. It does establish that the distribution is not random, and that the Uinta Basin area is a high-density cluster. That is a real finding worth incorporating into the picture. The practical question of what the Uinta Basin's unusual characteristics mean for the people who live there is worth addressing directly. The communities of the basin, Roosevelt, Vernal, Duchesne, the smaller towns, and the scattered ranching families, live with whatever the basin produces as a fact of daily life rather than as a research subject. Some residents are aware of the Skinwalker Ranch story and its documentation. Others are not. Neither awareness nor unawareness changes what the area produces. The cattle behavioral changes and the unusual lights that neighboring ranches describe have been part of the landscape of those ranches independent of any investigation. What the investigation has not produced is practical guidance for the people who live there. No official entity, not the BLM, not the county, not any state or federal agency, has issued any guidance about the unusual characteristics of specific areas within the basin. No agency has compiled the reports that would allow patterns to be identified and communicated. The gap between what the evidence suggests should be known, and what is officially communicated is not abstract here. It affects real people making real decisions about their land, their livestock, and their safety. Whether the phenomena are ultimately explicable in conventional terms or not, the absence of any official acknowledgement or investigation means that the people most directly affected by whatever the basin produces are navigating it without institutional support. That is the practical consequence of the institutional posture this series has been documenting, not in dramatic terms, but in the specific, daily experience of communities that live alongside phenomena their government has chosen not to study.